The film's very interesting, and why I chose the History Boys in a level 5 module called Playwriting was basically I wanted a relatively contemporary play. It was written in around 2004, the film was 2006. I wanted there to be a film of it because it was unlikely we were going to get to see it, and I wanted the film to be written by the playwright. And apart from anything else, it turned out in a National Theatre poll, it was the nation's favourite play. And coincidentally, unfortunately, there was a production by the Lindley Players in Whitstable. So I thought, great, this is going to be pretty straightforward. And in terms of the playwriting module, it's a combination of critical and creative as we build on what we've done at level 4 in terms of looking at how drama is constructed. And although there's lots of reading, I like to have core text, and so our core text was David Edgar's How Plays Work and Alan Bennett's The History Boys. So far, so good, and we were going to look at various themes, all of which are extrapolated on the handout I've given you, which was constructed with students to say, towards the end of the course, what are we going to be looking at? What are the fundamentals of playwriting? And I'm not going to dwell on that stuff because obviously that's really more subject specific. I was also building on the notions that we'd explored at level 4 in creative writing drama, which is mostly cinematic, on the hero's journey. And you may or may not be familiar with that, but there's a brief outline of some of the things we were looking at level 4, including psychological archetypes and the notion of a hero, stretching back from the Greeks through to contemporary superhero films with which the students would be familiar. As I say, I'm not going to dwell on the details there, except for a couple of quotes here from Rustin and Rustin in terms of psychoanalysis, which fits in with Jungian notions of the hero's journey. Both psychoanalysis and drama achieve understanding of the realities of human experience through their different kinds of investigation. The central concern of psychoanalysis has been with the question of how to live. The extreme states of mind that psychoanalysis has sought to investigate in its therapeutic role are analogous to the extreme states of mind that are subject of many of the greatest plays of the Western dramatic tradition. So I guess I felt pretty grounded in terms of we were going to look at difficult subjects, and in a sense you could ask, if drama isn't a safe arena for looking at difficult subjects, what is? And psychoanalysis, you may or may not agree, can give us a language that's certainly translated into drama, and it's no coincidence that Freud draws many of his theories from Greek literature. So our hero's journey has been translated from the Joseph Campbell, I know media people are familiar with this, through various authorities, Phil Cossinu and the like, and the text that we'd used had been the Vogler. And one of the most obvious examples of the hero's journey is Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, as she goes through Oz to really discover herself and different attributes of herself. So, we also had the context of other teacher films that kind of emerged from the module. Do you remember that?
Yes.
The teaching film module, education films module, from Educating Rita through to Dead Poets Society, even to School of Rock. And the idea of the hero in terms of Cossinu and so forth and Vogler is to master two worlds. So the hero comes back to Kansas, if you like, and can both incorporate everything they've learnt in Oz and bring it back to the homestead. And although a light comedy, School of Rock, epitomises that. So we come to the History Boys itself, and as most of you will know, it's the story of a bunch of very precocious sixth formers who are attempting to get into Oxbridge. And Bennett said he didn't research it particularly, it's kind of folk memory for him, but he epitomised two approaches to education through Irwin, who we see down here, who is brought in a sense, to teach to the test, and Hector, who's very much a kind of old-school liberal arts teacher, who's teacher of general studies as part of a general education and doesn't believe in teaching to the test. And it's a beautifully constructed play, looking not least at education and at history. One of the most famous scenes is where Hector's lesson, he's supposed to be teaching them sort of, I'm not sure what he's supposed to be teaching them, but they're basically exploring French through enacting a brothel scene. So it's a bit of drama and it's a bit of French. And you get the interruption of the headmaster, and the boys brilliantly collude with Hector to turn that into a scene from the First World War. And it shows really Hector at the height of his powers. The problem is, with the hero's journey, the problem is everything that we had constructed to look at, that's on the handouts, is what's not there. And really, I should have seen this, because you have a hero who gropes the kids. And I really hadn't anticipated, for want of a better word, the venom that this hero, anti-hero, then excited. And so, in our list, I was forgetting the major thing, really, which is what does an audience feel about what they're watching. And Hector rides on a motorbike, and the students occasionally get a lift from him, and he uses, when the motorbike pauses at the traffic lights, to lean back and to grope them. Now, this obviously is deeply problematic for any teacher. But Hector is positioned sympathetically, in the sense that we see him, he's discovered in the film, not in the play, by the lollipop lady, and there's a brilliant piece of differential knowledge where we see the lollipop lady's sign outside the headmaster's office, so we know Hector is doomed. And the headmaster really launches, when Hector says, well, nothing really happened, launches into a diatribe that's clearly homophobic. And Hector is, I think we're supposed to read as a repressed homosexual. He is married, but we then see Hector metaphorically reaching out to Posner, who is homosexual in the class. And it's a very empathetic and supportive scene. And Hector's talking about a Thomas Hardy poem, Drummer Hodge, but is really talking in terms of the identity of a single individual rather than someone just part of a mass grave. He's really talking about himself. And then we get the scene where Hector knows his curtains, and he breaks down with the students. And the students are hideously embarrassed and can't bear it, except for Posner, who does reach out. The kind of saving grace, if there is a saving grace for Hector, is the notion that the students themselves are resilient to his overtures, for want of a better word. That they regard him as a bit of a joke in that sense. And whose turn is it on the bike? And I certainly come from a culture, this is where it gets difficult. I come from a culture where, and I remember this in Muswell Hill and the Alley Pally, being flashed at. And with my sister, right? And she was pulling the pram for my younger brother Tom. I'm only 3 years older than him. So we must all have been very young. And my sister simply said, sort of, oh, I think we'd better go home now. And on the one hand, you can sort of say, well, I remember this stuff, so, it must have had some effect. On the other hand, I certainly don't feel traumatised by that. Later on, my sister seemed to attract such people. She went to live in Turin and wanted to pay homage to the home of the Turin Shroud, and as she approached where the Turin Shroud is stored, a bloke jumped out at her and flashed her there. So she kind of has a reputation in our family as attracting such things. And I'm saying all this with levity because that's the kind of culture in which I grew up. This is not the kind of culture in which I was teaching, because I thought I was teaching a problematic anti-hero. But actually the reaction of some of the boys especially was venomous. I remember one quote, what, we're supposed to feel sorry for him, meaning Hector. And yes, we are actually. That was the sort of reading that Bennett presents us with. The play at the time, interestingly, did get one critical reaction, I remember, which was something like An Old Gay's Wet Dream. I mean, there was one critic, I can't remember his name, who vociferously reacted against what has now become a sort of a national treasure from a national treasure. So I thought I was on pretty safe ground. I clearly wasn't. So what we then did was to discuss, theoretical approaches in terms of how we receive plays. And I'm certain that now, post Jimmy Savile and all the rest of it, despite Cliff Richard's exoneration, that now this play, because of the deep problems that Hector presents, and no one's hiding those, this play would not be considered, the most popular play in England. I kept saying it's important that we do utilise drama to face these difficulties. And what was then interesting was some confessional stuff that emerged more from the girls in the group about some what I would consider inappropriate stuff from teachers, but also they confessed to some inappropriate behaviour in terms of actually utilising their sexuality to embarrass some young male teachers. So the conversation, if you like, got really quite close to the knuckle, and I kept trying to return to the play, as I would. Too much information. And I certainly wasn't defending Hector the groper. Hector shouldn't be sacked, he should be escorted off the premises. If you don't know the play, in the end he's saved because the precocious Dapin basically says to the headmaster, well, if you sack Hector, your shenanigans chasing around your sexual harassment of the secretary with whom I'm dating, that will become public knowledge. And in the end, it's all rather ironic anyway, because, spoiler alert, Hector dies in a motorcycle accident towards the end of the film, and is remembered fondly. So on the one hand, we get the reception not only of how Bennett is angling this anti-hero, but also the response of the boys themselves, who remember him with great affection, versus the audience reception of the class, really steeped, rightly so, in the abuse of children by adults in positions of responsibility. And I found, drawing to a close, I found ultimately that theory helped. The abstraction of theory that they tend to resist actually was a safe ground to debate all this stuff. This is a quote from Dorothy, who's the sort of Mrs. Lintott's, the kind of conscience of the piece. And her sympathy towards Hector, while saying, groping a boy's balls is not the bloody Annunciation, she has a common sense, moral approach, but at the same time is friends of Hector. But she does say in a mock interview the teachers are holding there with the boys before they go off to Oxbridge, history is a commentary on the various and continuing capabilities of men. What is history? History is women following behind with a bucket. And that led, really interestingly, to the play being re-centred by the group, and not least by some pretty articulate women, as actually Mrs. Lintott's story. So the boys were seeing it as the ensemble piece of the precocious, frankly unrealistic sixth formers, and centering Hector really as the bad guy. The girls were refocusing the play as Mrs. Lintott's doing. And then we could debate actually how do we read plays in the first place. And so I used a little bit of educational theory in terms of Piaget and stages of development, because the boys are ridiculously precocious but believable within the world that Bennett creates. And Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, which is a much more socialised view. In other words, the boys have come to accept this as a joke rather than abuse because of each other's environment. Although Hector, his zone of proximal development is too proximal, really. I was going back to those notions of the hero's journey with Vogler, some of the technical stuff that's on the sheet with Edgar, and even the great Stefanovsky. We were using a bit of Goran's ideas about traps, and thoughts about what an interesting protagonist Hector is. Let's forget the moral judgments, suspend those, though ultimately we can't. But what if you do have a flawed hero? Isn't that more interesting than perhaps a Mr. Keating, although he is flawed himself, or why is Frank, an educated Rita, interesting? Because he's a great teacher, but he's pissed in his classes. In other words, the complexities of human relationships and identities are much more interestingly portrayed dramatically when you have interior conflicts like that. we went down the feminist route with Mrs. Lintott, but I sort of found some safe ground with Greenblatt and notions of new historicism. In other words, and it's the same when we get Shakespearean attitudes, perhaps, or Renaissance attitudes to the portrayal of Jewish people. In other words, you can only present a text with a balanced history, and I normally present a historicist approach, but a new historicist approach that pushes forward and balances with the text and doesn't privilege the text with the times, actually gives you a much greater sense of reception. And just to, I see the time's on the wing, but just to end, I mean, I think the play itself, I was going to read out something spontaneously, also from a very interesting scene whereby Hector's debating whether you can teach the Holocaust or not, which ties in directly with what Sam has just said. So it's a fascinating play about notions of education, but it's also, and relationships, but it's also a fascinating play in terms of history. And ultimately, Bennett presents two viewpoints. History is consequential, and so Hector, and some students wrote this, Hector has to die because he gets the moral, if you like, the moral judgment of history that is deserved. Or on this day we might say the breakup of the United Kingdom was a direct result of the referendum and Scottish wanting to go separate, which was a direct result of the rise of Nigel Farage or whatever. Or you could say, because Hector dies in an accident, history is accidental. In other words, was there less rain in London on Thursday? More people might have turned out to change the result. So I brought really, or directed, the debate away from the sort of infamy of Hector's groping through to seeing these characters and their fates in a historical light, which is very much what the play demands us to do. And I'll close there, but it was hairy for a while.
Wonderful. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, a chance for any comments or questions to Paul? Infamy. Paul got infamy.
Well, how did the students respond to it? Did they learn? Did they progress?
Yeah, well, I mean, ironically, although we had these very interesting, heated discussions, the essays they produced, I felt, were more sort of theoretically advanced than most that had been produced. Yeah. So again, that Blakean notion of without contraries there is no progression. So I very much welcome this centre because I think it's where we're rubbing up against the unsafe stuff that things can really go well. But I also think, I felt certainly when they got in confessional mode, I felt an instinct to shut down the conversation, to be honest. But then if drama's to mean anything, it should reflect us back on the psychology of our own lives.
But that instinct to shut it down probably didn't come from within, it came from a sense of the organisation or the...
Sure. If I was going to talk about the sex, drugs and rock and roll thing, I was so wary, my slide of several slides on 1967 says brackets, don't take, close brackets, drugs. Just to be, so I could not be kind of accused of promoting, the LSD or anything. Just as I was really wary about talking about this, to be honest, because of an institutional safety net that isn't actually a safety net. I think it represses things.
I think it's brilliant what you've done because you've gone from what are headline simplistic binary. He's a paedophile, or all these terrible things. To go into a situation of complexity where different ideas can be discussed. And I think it's admirable. That's almost the model of what I want to do with all of my teaching, to go from simplicity to shades of grey, to actually make things become more tricky.
Sure. But I take the political point you're making. That could be translated as, Skinner's teaching pedos, or whatever.
I've seen it arise over the years that I've been teaching a course called The Cinematic City. And when we focus on New York, inevitably we do Woody Allen. And over the last, particularly 3 or 4 years, screening Manhattan has become very problematic for the students. And the same sorts of questions arise. For those of you who know that film, will recognise the disparity in age between the central figures, quite large, and my students have become increasingly uneasy about not just watching the film but discussing it.
Sure.
Notions of cinematic sittingness, a beautiful example though it is of that, tend to disappear, and what comes to the foreground is the Woody Allen story.
Yeah.
And so I'm really interested to see how you dealt
Absolutely.
with that.
And I think part of my instinct too was that, yes, this is a rich play. I mean, I have problems with it myself. I'm not a great fan of it, to be honest, for other reasons. But there was a phase where the students seemed to be getting obsessed, perhaps like with the Woody Allen story, on this particular angle, rather than looking, and that's where I was trying to steer them back to, thinking about education, thinking about history, and thinking about the flawed nature of human beings.
Yeah. Well, could you share some of the, you were mentioning Greenblatt particularly. Could you share some of that reading with us in any way?
Well, all I'd say is, I very much adopt a very really traditional sort of English literature approach, almost, that I'm trying to get away from that with this sort of dramaturgy, in terms of a text in context.
Yeah.
And I guess what I was trying to do with the new historicism was to explore more than I would have the times in which this was written. There's a useful preface by Bennett at the beginning of the book, and looking at that, and looking at a sort of folk memory too, I guess, of how this was written, because he didn't. My major objection is the kids are all so fantastically precocious. It's just utterly unrealistic. I've been taught in schools. But nevertheless, to try and preface the fact that, this is a play set in the 80s, what was going on there and so forth, and actually then utilising the quite understandable student anxiety about paedophilia and abuse and what has happened, since. But also trying to temper that with a sort of, let's be aware of moral outrages. It's really difficult because I wasn't accused of defending paedophilia, but you can get into that kind of a mindset from students whereby I think they're so inculcated with the notion of a teacher like Hector touching up these boys that, he would, it should be instantly sacked. I'm not defending that, but the notion of what's really going on for that guy in his life.
Sorry, was there somebody, Sarah, and then we'll take Brian.
I was just going to say, will you continue to teach that?
No, this is where I wish you hadn't asked that. No. So all my bravado dissolves. No, to be honest, I've taught it in a couple of years now, and I kind of feel time for something else. But I'm not as cowardly as I sound, because I'm going to introduce Equus, which has full frontal nudity, religious psychosexuality, and the blinding of horses. But a cinch compared to Hector.
The reason I ask is I teach a secondary advertising module.
Oh, right.
And I use the Benetton campaign that we all know from the 80s. And I've only been here 3 years, but every year it kind of gets more problematic, similar to what you're saying. We get the debate around not what it's meant to be around.
Yes.
And I feel, culturally it's so far away from my experience when I saw it at 18 to these first years seeing it. And I'm just thinking about, do I actually walk away and do something totally different? Or do I do it, another year and see if I can almost, because what I ended up doing this year was sharing kind of the previous year's experience with it as well.
Yes,
so
no, exactly. And I kind of have a 2-3 year run at text anyway, where I feel you're getting into it. Second year you're mastering it, and then it becomes frankly a bit tired. So that, to be honest, that's the reason I'm not doing it anymore. But nevertheless, I'm not going to miss those debates. I don't think.
Brian, did you want to add anything?
Move on. Sort of an observation, but also a question really. That's fantastic, and it's so. In some ways, it's so easy to be seduced by the weight of the issues. And I think that's really important. I'm not trying to downgrade that, but I also want to say there's something else happening in what you're doing, and that's you're subverting slightly your own authority as a teacher, you're opening up to confusion. And you're recentering what education is about as the construction of meaning rather than the delivery of information or facts or the right answers.
Yes.
And I think that's possibly even more subversive, potentially, than the sort of content issues you talked about.
Well, I think they were disturbed. I wasn't just point blank, Hector's a pedo, send him to the gallows kind of thing. But I was saying, let's go back to the text, let's go back to some of these theoretical approaches. And that's what kind of saves the day. But at the same time, if drama doesn't move us, if drama doesn't, disturb us in many ways, what's it for? And the counterbalance really is in...
So about education.
You could.
If education doesn't,
The counterbalance is in music and performing arts, where I also teach. Sarah Kane, with her extraordinarily explicit violence and cannibalism and rape and everything, is the sort of number one choice for student dissertations and things, if a single playwright is taken. So it's quite interesting what... In the student body, it might be just because those students are more steeped in theatre and Jacobean drama or whatever. But what is it is not acceptable, not in terms of behaviour, but in terms of texts.